So yeah, we made stencils, but like the people don't, you know, we didn't need any instructions. We just kind of figured out that we had to cut holes. So yeah, my experience with punk until this, because you know, I hadn't thought you could just do pop art, or it's just like band logos or messages, whereas this just showed you could be yeah, you could just do anything. It's fun. It's a real, you know, why this looks very simple now, but to me it's like, wow, I could just cut a camel. And, you know, in fact, I think I did cut a camel. So at school and later on art college, me and my friend used to cut stencils, and we just take it, you know, you just do it out to tea for an hour and then go somewhere and paint it that night, and then after a few days that was created, yeah, a scene like that basically. So yeah, so I used to do it in
so to really deal
late
with
mid-80s.
stencil graffiti was with this book. So that was like after class was your first.
Yeah, I mean that's
to
how
really
we would
deal with that.
Yeah, we didn't have so many stencils in the UK at that time. I hadn't been on the beach, and then when that came along, you know, people kind of found that.
Yeah, there was
This particular copy I bought in the Arnold Beanie in Bristol,
Okay.
and they had a street art show there in Bristol, so that would have been seen at the same time.
we make a tribute to Thomas Neurath, who was the editor of Thames and Hudson, or is still, I think, the senior.
Yeah, so we share the same publisher, and I wrote Thames and Hudson in 1999, said I'd like to do a book on stencils, and I want to connect this to what's going on in Bristol. So I wanted to talk about the French stencils before what was happening in Bristol, London, and then once I got. So I contacted Thames and Hudson because I thought, well, if they publish this one, maybe they'll publish.
It would fit like a storyline.
Yeah, and I used a quote from this text. The text is not yours.
Bailly, no, it's a philosopher, French philosopher.
It's a really great text here.
Jean-Christophe Bailly is really a guide to follow.
Yeah.
So
It's
wonderful. So he started to go here. He says graffiti is like a tattoo on the walls of the cities. And you have cities without tattoos, like Dubai. There's no graffiti in Dubai. You know, it was, you know, when I read this text, I said, wow, it's really, and he had a lot of stuff like in the preface. The tattoo on the walls, you know, it's like a tattoo.
And also
from the cities.
This seriality that you have the stencil and they're all connected in the city, which we know from Banksy's red later, that you have this kind of red epidemic everywhere. That's also in this early text.
Sometimes that's what I was in this time was lovely. So there was a secret communication, and there was a kind of respect. So when you made your stencil, there was no other stencil artist going on it. He would adjust on the side. For example, I remember here the Eiffel Tower. You saw the Eiffel Tower, okay? So you sprayed the Eiffel Tower, and next day or 3 days later, you come back and want to see the Eiffel Tower, and there was somebody putting a parakeet, papagay, I don't know how you say it, parrot.
The parrot on the
sprayed a parrot on top of the Eiffel. So
it's in the book, isn't it?
yeah, and it's so nice because you see, there's another guy. He saw your Eiffel Tower, and he imagined to put not over your Eiffel Tower, but he put in a context. So a communication, a secret underground communication.
Yeah.
And I think around 1990 this stops because then style writing graffiti really took over. At the start, for example, Bando very often put his tag next to stencil graffiti when there was a large black tag, and Bando would put his tag next to it. So it's kind of because it was photographed very often and what the locations to put these things for tags. But after a while, this took over. So around 1989, 1990, this was kind of the end of the bourgeois movement.
At the same time, something like spray can art, they had lots of photos and stencils and tags and other stuff and street art, but it wasn't included because they made a decision, like you said in the film.
Yeah,
The graffiti is what we want to see freehand.
they want. Yeah, that's
There's this huge archives of other stuff that was happening at the same time, but it got written out of the story because that wasn't the premise of the book.
That's true, but it's also a strange thing because, for example, James Frigoff, he told me not long before he died here at the SOC conference when it was during the pandemic. He said, "Yeah, we took a photo of a stencil which is in the book by Kingpin, but it's not. It's not." I asked Kingpin, and also if you look at the photo, it's not a stencil. It's a freehand piece. So I thought that's quite curious thing that these kind of graffiti photographers had such problems very often even to identify stencils. Like the same thing with this quote about Robert Danaya and Henry Chalfant. And Henry Chalfant, who lived in New York, he said, yeah, I have the quote even.
I think it was an editorial decision because we know now that there was lots of other types of street art going on.
They wanted to feature the craft of freehand graffiti, and that was important. But it's also like sometimes a little bit of ignorance. If you look at this quote, I like them a lot, stencils in Barcelona, they don't do them in New York, which is a very strange thing because there are so many photo material from late 70s, early 80s in New York, but Henry Chalfant did not know it. Or it's very...
Is it an interactive panel? Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I think the reason is because it's a different genre. It's not, they were documenting, New York style subway writing. And the stencils were different. Like it's not like they were trying to say we're doing all of the stuff that is done with a spray can in New York. It's different. With like a different type of artistic expression that they were not into. So that's my thing.
Yeah. For example, Martha Cooper, she did photos. Martha Cooper is different. Martha Cooper did take photos of stencil graffiti in New York, so she knew there was stencil graffiti in New York. And Henry Chalfant said, yeah, sometimes it's like Europeans coming there, but it's not the case. So it's
similar period. There was a book called Soho Graffiti.
Yeah,
that just focuses on stencils. So it depends on the author. But I think because spray can art is such a big book that everyone could live by. It kind of. That was interesting. It just focused on that. That became the biggest graffiti movement. So
it's true, and that's a good example because Soho Graffiti is a book, and on the cover it has a stencil by Alex Valori, which is also in the film, but it's anonymous, so nobody knew who was that guy who took this, who did this piece, and he came from Sao Paulo. And we have his niece here in the audience today who came to see the film. And I wrote a lot with the family also to receive some of the photos we see here.
I came across that Solari when I did my graffiti Brazil book.
Yes, it's mentioned in there. Yeah.
So when I went to Brazil, there was still some on the walls. Still some old ones on the walls, and that introduced me to earlier generations of street art, like Tupinonda, just the performance artists from the 60s. So there's all these different, from the film we've just seen, there's all these different concurrent art movements around the world. you know.
And for me, this Alex Bolari is particularly interesting because he was really received in Poland. So Polish graffiti artists saw this stuff in New York, went to Poland and started a stencil graffiti scene there. And it's in Poitras à la Une, another book from the Poitras movement. There are 3 Alex Bolari stencils somebody took photos of in New York.
Yeah.
And put them in this book. So it was received in France, in Poland, in New York, but he's from Sao Paulo. So and this is he's died in 1987, so it's really early.
Yeah, I think that's really
international.
Yeah.
It's really interesting how New York was such a hotspot. There was that crossover also with Keith Haring, who's Haring to Sao Paulo. And I think he was friends with Alex Bolari, am I right with that? There was some sort of...
There are stories that Alex Bolari painted with Basquiat, and that he had interaction with Warhol, that Warhol commented on some stuff. He is on the one door I showed, where he's with Warhol on one door. But that's the only interaction I can really point my finger to that happened. But they're at the same time on the same wall, so it's really it's really possible.
Yeah, I mean, New York, and you know, we're all like time travel to New York in the 1980s, right? That's where.
Or to Paris in 1985.
Seems to have been a place where, you know, black popped up, exploded, and people passed through and they learned from each other.
And there's another quote I really would like to discuss. Where is it?
But it's funny also that when you say about this year, it's innocent. There was no publicity effect, you know. Perhaps one article in the press they showed.
That's an interesting point.
Well,
we were just talking about this had an innocent feeling of innocence because this is pre kind of the idea of street art being a way into an art career, even though they were hanging outside Soho galleries and galleries outside Paris, they were milking, they were trying to get in and they didn't get in very quickly.
I disagree in both cities because in for example, Speedy Graffiti, one said this was also one of the first stencils you photographed with Speedy Banana.
His name.
And he was referring to his calling card and sometimes even putting a number and trying to get in contacts with galleries. And David Wojnarowicz in 1981, he really sprayed deliberately on galleries. Like you know this from he was featured in your book, the banana sprayer, who deliberately puts on galleries and like and Wojnarowicz did that 5 years before the banana sprayer started. He did that also to get in, and it was his ticket into the gallery scenes because people knew this burning house. And then a photographer who was a friend, he was introduced and he said, yeah, I know who did those things. And then he got his gallery show because
but it's also concurrent with this modest sort of style of just everyone having a go. So it would have been alongside somebody who'd done something like you, like for a couple of years and then left it. So it's part that you can see those people that were deliberately doing it outside Soho and galleries, but at the same time in a mass of other stuff. So it's not. Career artists and non-career artists together.
A lot of guys that don't even die. You know,
the mystery ones.
Often very, very good ones.
I thought there are 2 more quotes I would discuss. One is by Jörg Huber, and the other one is by Ernest Pignon Ernest. it's a quite long one. I will shorten it up. It's kind of, he says, I gave up spray stenciling, stencil graffiti, because it didn't suit what I was trying to communicate, because I couldn't cut good stencils. And then I saw Jeff Aerosol's stencil, and that kind of 30 years later, then he said, yeah, oh, yes, it's still possible to do that in this kind of way. And he kind of, the graphic poverty of a few stencils that took up the idea of life-size body, which I encountered in the 80s, which are really harsh comment on life-size stencils in France in the 80s from Pignot NS, reinforced my feeling. So he said, yeah, it's not possible to do that with a stencil illegally on the street. And I would say, Jörg Huber, you did a bit say the opposite when you talked about Pignot NS, that you say, yeah, you saw a Pignot NS paperwork, and you said, yeah, but it's not as good as a stencil.
I would not value it. It's different.
But I think there's a little bit of that it communicates something completely different, which Pignot NS said it's not possible, and that's exactly what you like about it. And the other thing is maybe too realistic.
No, the aspects was more or less when you are in your safe atelier and you spray on paper like posters, and then you go out and you glue it on the wall, is for me different, because the aspect of danger, going out in the night with, I saw the stencil of Blake, it must be a stencil like this,
life-size,
life-size. So going out, you have to have your colors. So a rucksack like you is absolutely, and you have to have it with the colors in. So it's more dangerous. You are directly on the wall. You know, there's no paper. The other is paper in between. This was the only aspect I said. You know, it's for me as artist, I would say it makes a difference. Yeah. If you have in your safe atelier, you know, you do it there.
That's because technical advancements, basically, that was in the area of photocopy shops or hand drawing. And since we reached the 90s, people had DTP.
Yeah.
They could play around in Photoshop and print it out to any size you like.
You get laser cut.
And yeah, so of course it looks more sophisticated now. What you can do full size.
But I think it also loses something, which I think which you also said in the interview. At some point they all look a bit the same, because they all maybe use the same software and the same reducing.
They look very familiar as Photoshop filters rather than the feeling of the hand drawn stencil, basically.
Because when you see the origin, like it was really
anyway,
it's
a very broad topic.
There
are hundreds of different hand styles.
Styles. But you have in your film, I did discover a lot of information I did not know before. I don't know if it was Jeff Aerosol who had a stencil and moving it and spray it at the same time.
Yeah, it was back footage.
This is, you know, it's an artist, so he starts to cut the root, to invent new.
Yeah,
and this is, I think, this is the germ. I don't know how you say the kind, the origin of art. To make it different, to say no, it must be possible.
It is very versatile. I mean, I can think of artists like Daniel Lilly from Sao Paulo, and his work is about errors, like you showed, thanks to saying that with drippy paint. His stuff was when Daniel Lilly cuts stencil, often he'll leave sticky paint on it and then, you know, press them, and the mess is part of it. It's a bit like, you know, printing something badly. So it's interesting how it's just another example of how stencil art, just by doing, learns learns another technique.
And it's both. It's what you described, but also like really twisting the image itself and then cut it like Jody, a Bristol stencil artist. He used a TV set and put a paper on it and like kind of blurred and inversed photos Pablo Fiasco, who did like string faces which are blurred, but they were blurred during the process of spraying, although they look similar to what Jeff also did, but he did it he cut it like that, and a bit like when he sprayed it, that he didn't put the paper completely to the wall. But I think that's also typical for this, like in the tagging graffiti movement. When there's lots of competition, there is development, and people try to stand out with color or with size or with techniques to do something else after a while.
But I remarked that you were talking about it. We have kind of, you use the word here, Banksy effect. So the style is much more the same now. You know, when you see the outcuts, it's a kind of realistic. You know what I mean? You know, like the Banksy style. You know,
Yeah,
you have
that's become a.
when you see the other, it was really, you know, it was.
It's
You know,
very copied style.
Yeah, and
there are other artists working in different styles.
But I think there's also interesting that Banksy started out rather as an analog artist, like with very often mentioning interviews, copy machine and really like not using computers for quite a while. And you worked with him, and you were more the person who could transfer those images maybe to a computer. And of course later I think he would use a computer as well, but it depends, I would say.
Yeah, I think to finish this was analog. These were analog times. So there was no computer. There was not the possibility of unlimited automatic distribution. You know, this was even graffiti was different. You know, because the wall was different, or your spray can did not work anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that this is also a good phrase perhaps to get it together. Too much computers.
Yes.
Is perhaps also a little bit disastrous. You know, a little computer could be wonderful.
Headlong into AI right now.
Yes,
So,
that's
as analog as possible, I think, the way to go. Are there any other, before we could probably just chat for hours.
Yeah,
let's include people, if there's anything from the hour video or response. Or we'll just keep talking about stuff.
There was some question. I will try to repeat here, but I think it starts. Then we are actually running time for future presenting.
Okay.
So we are good in terms of timing.
Yeah.
I think it was really curious. I was thinking when it becomes be exactly or not, you know, because it's not really, you know, right? Because it's just one blank surface to do a spray thing. Are you using testing, or it's just a technical resource that's not completely expensive? Does it need to have a form? You know, where's the limit of the schedule as a technique?
So as long as you stencil, you know, this is you know, you have to have the I could say a reproducible form cut out on metal or paper, or I don't know what should be a little bit sticky, because if not, the color will soften it and then it flattens down. But as you showed the Argentinian, he put only the cravat on serigraffiti or on stencil, and he painted around the face of the girl. So this is interesting too. So this would be agenda.
And
It's
a mixture.
yeah, mixed of both, which is a good idea, in fact.
3D is also like a good example for something in between, because we use tape a lot. So you have one clear line, but you don't have a stencil in that way. So it's kind of a hybrid or tending to be a stencil. I think the stencil is first and foremost a tool or a concept, but there are things that are very close. It's also interesting when you look at the words, like in Polish, for example, the word to attach a stencil means to print a stencil. And for me, coming from a German background, print always has something with pressure, and you don't use more pressure than when you do freehand graffiti to do a stencil graffiti. So there is no Druck in German. It's connected to pressure. So sometimes it's called close to printing, a printing technique, and sometimes it's called a painting technique. Or so it's somewhere in between, depending on the
I think
country.
you're right, Pedro. You can really, really stretch the idea of stencil, because we can make a stencil with this and that. You have made a stencil.
Absolutely. The last cool hand is nice, because is it a stencil? He used his hand, I don't know how much million years before.
Yeah, that is the first stencil.
This is good, because it's the first stencil. And the pencil. You can paint with it.
Yeah.
And stretching it
Nice,
out, we've
nice
got,
idea. Positive and negative.
Opposite of a stencil, you're cutting in, you're drilling into a wall, it's still a shape, or somebody like reverse graffiti, you're painting away dirt. I mean, you could stretch that concept of stencil
Quite far.
as far as.
I did,
The other thing I think of is layering. Everything we see in Photoshop is a layer, and pencils, it's just a layer. So,
It's true, like when we had layering, you could also kind of call it a stencil. It really depends on how you define it. And also for Wojnarowicz, there were like things that were stenciled and but also the stencil tools became artworks, because you can exhibit them. They are still showing an image, not when you have a freehand graffiti piece, you have a spray can and you have maybe the drawing in the black book, but you don't have something in between so much. And the stencil is in between.
I cut out you remember the September model? I was using it on the negative, because it was too much. Yeah. So, this was really, it was life size. Yeah, I did it for the Bicentenaire in Paris.
But illegally.
Yeah, and it was Place de Concorde. It was because there was a guillotine, so I had to. So the story is, in fact, the French nation was celebrating 200 years of French Revolution, and I was there because it was 1908, and then I was 1989. So I was there, and it was a real big by the Etat. Culture, they did marionette and everything. So it was a big circus, from the Culture Institute of France. And I don't know, as a little German, I thought, ooh, you only show the good side. It was, in fact, a revolution is all the time also murder and blood floating. It's not just a circus. And then you have the human rights and things like this. So
and that's also like an interesting phenomenon, because it's popping up at different times, again and again to make this kind of murder outline, like Richard Hambleton did in 1976. Also, an artist who's not a stencil artist, but very much connected to stencil, because many stencil artists cite him, and he used stencil for detail, like a gun, or again Pablo Fiasco, who did also this kind of outlines. So that's something. It comes in different contexts. It reappears, but not interconnected.
I tried to find the places, so it was for me to remind the victims. I said every revolution has victims. You know, there are some of the right guys, but sometimes there are also not of the poor guys in between. And I found the streets where the guillotine was, and I found streets where, for example, Lavoisier was a chemist, very young chemist, but with the intrigue, with the Jacobins. So somebody had a rivalité, and they said, oh, he was against the revolution. So it was very quick, and they cut his head. So they were more or less, which is known as the September murder, the massacre of September. I think 1,200 persons. So I said, don't forget this. A revolution is perfect, but there is all the time a lot of blood.
Yeah.
And so I cut it out on how could you say a yoga mat.
Mattress.
Yeah, a yoga mat, so I could roll it, you know, because it has not to be remarked, and then put it on the places where it's
Another part that was, I think, for me to see in the movie and to hear you talk, was the stencil as a medium of dissemination of a practice. It's easier for you to ask someone to do a stencil than to do, freehand activity. So you give the format and the technique, and almost everyone can do it, right? It's something that's more inducible or reproducible, easier to do for non-artists, And the medium of, let's say, way of putting people to work for specific ideas, being independently from the spectrum, right? If it's left or right or whatever kind of idea, it can be commercial or non-commercial, but it's a very easily reproducible medium. It's not like
and it's on both sides, like the people who spray paint it, they can send it to other cities, like they did in Poland. They send it via post, and people spray painted the same stencil in other cities. Or John Fechner did that also in the 70s, that he sent it to Sweden, and people did stencil graffiti with his stencil in Sweden. So it's kind of, you have the composition and the form. There's a lot of creativity, or like canned creativity in the stencil, and you could put it somewhere else. And that was also one question.
As a resource for activism, it's more
for activism, but also for spreading. And it's the same with on the receiver side. When there's like a freehand political parole saying fuck whoever, then it seems like a single person may be angry, may be spontaneous, but if you see in one quarter like 40 stencils, you think there's like an organization behind it, and that's exactly what happened. That there's a single person who spray painted it all over the city, and it's not an organization, but it became an organization. But I think that's also like the question of authorship. Like when you do a graffiti and you have a hand style, of course, other people can try to copy that. But if you have really the stencil, it's much closer. It also depends on the work. But what's the role of the author is quite
reduced, right?
Yeah,
For reproduction, we've seen that on the museum of Banksy Museum thing.
Yeah,
they can make this commercial thing around reproduction of, because it's somehow it's possible, right? There are skills needed, of course, but at the same time it's possible. You cannot do that you can do that with fake if you get like really high expert fakes of oil painting and stuff, but kind of easier to do it on the extent.
yeah, easier. But it's also, it doesn't have to depend so much on style, but also on for example, Fechner, he just uses letters. It's not a style in itself, because he even used letters you can buy. You have to copy them himself. So, but it's still his work and his ideas that move in. So what do you think about this? What's the artwork or this? I think that's really interesting to say about the author. Who's the author? The one who spray painted, or the one who cut the stencil?
In the best case, it's the day first.
Yeah, I think it's the same with any artist, isn't it? It's the intention and the concept and the idea, the drawing, design. That's the authorship. Obviously, with the stencil, you may have a plan, but actually cut it, you think, oh, maybe change it as I go along. So you're making aesthetic decisions with that, and then you're making aesthetic decisions when you paint it. You think, oh well, maybe I'll just bring it up or down, or feather the edge. So you're making decisions all the way through. Somebody's job it is to fake Banks's museums. Isn't making so many aesthetic choices, so you just photocopy. It's just a photocopy decision. So I would say it ideally it has the author's hands throughout, but then a lot of artists I've been looking at in my last book, some of them are doing enormous mural-sized stencils, so it would be crazy for them to cut it out themselves. Sometimes they'll get 20 people to cut it out, and they need help, but it's still their work, even if they've got 20 people to cut it. And like your first point, Pedro, stencils a very good way into art. Easier than if you were to have a freehand stencil workshop. The results might be quite good, but if you help them with some stencil shapes, they'll feel like, oh, actually, that looks like a picture, quickly. So for me, it's a good way into art.
And maybe there's also more happening at the end on the wall. It's not just the cutting process, but I think, because I often wonder why graffiti writers very often don't like the stencil so much, or don't like people using stencils. I think it's sometimes they underestimate how much decisions you still make on the wall, and how far it's away or close to the wall, or how much you change at the end. It's not everything is prefabricated, but it's an interesting thing. Why is there this? Like, for example, 3D. He started. He was one of the very early graffiti writers in freehand style in England at all. And after a few years, he was really people attacked him and said, somebody's using a stencil. You're faking your, and that's such a strange thing. And the same happened in France or in Germany, that the first graffiti writers very often started with stencils, but it's kind of at the end, the story is always like a teaching.
Well, I'm glad 3D got a lot of mentions, because I wanted in my first book stencil graffiti, because it's like his stencils are around. And actually, they weren't just those ones you showed. A lot of them were just regular stencils. And there was a pub where we used to play pool, called the Montpellier, and it was just covered in pop art stencils that he'd done. They weren't an extreme freehand, they were just pop art stencils. No one seems to have any photos of those. A few have appeared in the Bristol show recently, but. Anyway, I invited him to the book, but he's like, man, I'm not interested. So maybe he'd grown out stencils by then, but he certainly was important at the time, but not so much. We didn't see so much of this freehand and stenciling. And when I made my book, following your footsteps, I called it stencil graffiti, but that was problematic because, we're at graffiti street art conference and people argue about the word graffiti and they argue about the word street art and, maybe this should be called stencil street art, but graffiti just seemed to pass down from decades to decades. So even though I knew it was a problematic word, it just made sense to call it stencil graffiti, even though at the same time we had graffiti artists doing, well, forget that. That's not freestyling. That's not my graffiti.
Yeah,
It's somebody else's graffiti.
It's both. It's from both sides. Like Jakob Kimball is here and called his book The G Word. That the graffiti writers sometimes very often hate the word graffiti as well. And on the other side, many graffiti artists took over this word and said, yeah, we are graffiti. This is street art. This is something different. But graffiti, the sprayer of Zurich was in the media and everybody was talking about graffiti in the 70s. There was lots of graffiti in the 60s, but the term was kind of occupied at some point by style writing graffiti. And so I think it's quite good, like Paris graffiti or your book Stencil graffiti, because it's more a reference to the older meaning, or the original meaning of graffiti, not so much the meaning that is now the mainstream meaning of graffiti.
This is insider. This is the professor. Yeah, nobody I never went deep into it.
Yeah, it's in this conference we get a lot of this different. I'm trying to get another mind that works on this deepness. That's Peter Bennington. Is publishing a book. I don't know if you are around, Peter. I'm not getting your reply to my messages here.
Oh, sorry.
You are here.
Yes,
Okay.
I am here.
So you are on. I was stretching the time a bit. I think you need an end of applause, and we put Peter to present the book, and then we go for a short interval. But Peter, you have the time for the presentation.
Great.
And I hope you can share the screen. You are okay with that?
I'm gonna try. Just a second. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Let me just see if I can make it full screen as well. Do you see it full screen now?
Not yet.
Okay, then it probably doesn't work. Let me just see here. Let me see if I can do it up here instead. I had the same problem last week. Let me just see. Are you seeing it full screen now?
No, not yet, Peter.
Okay.
Thank a patient audience and interested. Thank you very much. Very nice to see you in Lisbon and with you. And thank you for all your organization.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Let's just see here. Hi everybody. I don't know if you can see me at least.
Can you see it?
Just 1 second.
No.
I'll just show it like this instead. That should be
Can we
fine.
install the camera here on the auditorium? I know you can see me.
I see you, yeah. I see you.
Yeah. How are you?
Here we go. Can you see this?
Yes.
All right, great. Then I'll just show it like that. I can try to make it full screen and see, but I'm not sure that it's gonna work. I don't know why it doesn't work. Do you see it full screen now?
Yes, now it's working.
All right, excellent. Then we'll just run it like that instead. So let me just pull up my notes here. Hello, everybody. I can't see anyone in the audience, but I heard you just talking before, so I know that there's somebody there. My name is Peter Bengtsen. I'm an art historian and sociologist at Lund University. I don't know who's in the auditorium, but I imagine that a lot of us already know each other. As you know, the theme of this year's conference is numbers, and the book that I'm going to be presenting today has very little to do with numbers. But since I've just finished it, I still thought that it would be nice to share. So even though my book is not really about numbers, there's one number that I do want to mention, and that is the number 10. Because wow, it's the 10th Lisbon Urban Creativity Conference this year. And I'm so glad that Pedro has been able to carry this on for so long. It's a fantastic feat. We put on one urban creativity conference in Lund a few years ago, and I know how much work that was. So I attended the first Lisbon conference in 2014, and I had just defended my PhD thesis, which I presented as my first book called The Street Art World. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, great. It's just I only see you, Pedro, and it looked like you were frozen.
Sorry, it's the new camera to the.
No worries. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't speaking into the ether here. Yeah, so I presented my first book at the first conference. And 4 years later, in 2018, I was there to present my second book, Street Art and the Environment. And I think there's no doubt that Lisbon has played a very important role in spreading my research to other scholars. And of course, I'm very grateful for that. But apart from being a venue where we can present our own work, the conference has always also been an opportunity to meet a growing interdisciplinary family of people interested in graffiti, street art, and other types of urban creativity. And for me, as I suspect for many of you, the trip to Lisbon has also become a small getaway. And I've made a point of attending the conference every year since 2014, although regrettably I've not been able to do so in person for the past 2 years. In 2021, I was waiting for the birth of my first daughter, so I wasn't able to travel. And in 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine forced me to take a break from working, including writing and presenting. And now for the 10th Lisbon conference, I'm once again waiting for a daughter to be born. We expect her any day now, so I'm not able to travel and be with you in person. Still, I'm very happy to be able to present remotely today my third monograph rather, which is entitled Tracks and Traces: Exploring the World of Graffiti Writing Through Visual Methods. When I first set out to write this book, I had in mind two central objects of study. One was the world of graffiti writing in Malmö, where I live, and the other was the visually oriented research practices that I've employed to approach that world. However, as the project progressed, I increasingly focused on the methodological aspects, while the graffiti world became of secondary concern. In other words, in the context of the study behind this book, my ongoing exploration of the graffiti world has mainly become a vehicle for having methodological discussions about the use of visual methods in graffiti research. This being said, the graffiti world remains an important part of Tracks and Traces, as it's the phenomenon at which my method experiments were directed. The book considers the use of visual methods as a way of approaching otherwise difficult to access fields. In the case at hand, it's the world of graffiti writing in Malmö, Sweden, as I've already mentioned. And two central ideas that are put forward in the book are that visual expressions such as graffiti are meaningful conveyors of information about the world in which they are produced. And the second idea is that the visual methods discussed in the book can provide supplementary knowledge to that derived from more traditional person-focused fieldwork. These ideas are underpinned by empirical material from Malmö, where I have lived and engaged with graffiti since 2010. Exploring the connection between graffiti and the world of graffiti writing brings into focus how visual expressions and visual methods can contribute to knowledge production when other approaches to the field are unfeasible. It should be noted that while this study focuses on the specific case of graffiti and graffiti writing in Malmö, many of the methodological points made here also hold up in relation to other empirical contexts and phenomena. Tracks and Traces then has three main objectives, all of which relate to research methodology. First, it discusses how visual material resulting from or in other ways related to graffiti writing may allow outsiders to explore and gain an understanding of an otherwise difficult to access field. Importantly, it's not suggested that visual methods, which is to say the collection, analysis, and production of visual material, should or could entirely replace fieldwork methods that require direct contact with informants. Rather, it's shown that using methods which focus on the collection and treatment of visual data may be a viable initial and or supplementary approach. And it's demonstrated how such visual methods can provide insight, not just about graffiti writers' practices, but also about, for example, the social standing of and the relations between agents in the field. Second, the book explores videography as a visual method for collecting and reflecting on empirical material, and video as a medium for conveying research processes and findings. And third, in relation to videography and video, the book reflects on how working with unfamiliar methods and media can help expand researchers' method toolkits and reevaluate previously collected empirical material. The use of experimental research methods is further discussed with reference to my experiences using a combination of self-produced graffiti scenes, physical scavenger hunts, and social media posts to engage with other members of Malmö's graffiti world. And some of you may remember that my experiments with videography and with the scavenger hunts were the focus of my presentations at this conference in 2019 and 2020, respectively. The book is divided into four main chapters. Chapter 1 presents some overarching thoughts on the previous graffiti scholarship and the use of visual methods, thereby outlining the background for the study. Curiously, I've found very little in-depth discussion about visual methods in relation to research on graffiti, so I believe that this book kind of at least attempts to fill that gap. Chapter 2 tells a story of how I gained insight into the world of graffiti writing in Malmö after I moved to the city in 2010. More specifically, it recounts and critically discusses the methods by which I initially came to understand the graffiti world. Unlike other researchers who have conducted their studies by interacting in person with graffiti writers, my focus has mainly been on the visual expressions that writers leave behind. Even though it can be difficult for outsiders to gain access to a field like the graffiti world, collecting and studying the visual products of that social environment can yield valuable information and over time provide the researcher with credibility and a position within the field. Chapter 3 explores videography as a visual method and video as a medium. It puts forward the central point that video, due to its visual, temporal, and sequential nature, can capture and communicate findings differently than written accounts and still images. This argument is in part made by including in the chapter a 26-minute research video titled Tracing Kegger, which relates to the viewer the physical and mental aspects of the process of looking for graffiti tags at the outskirts of Malmö. And that video was actually shown for the first time in public at this conference in 2019. Further, the experience of making the video is discussed from a methodological perspective. It's argued that working with unfamiliar methods and media can help researchers reevaluate previously collected empirical material and reflect on how such material influences subsequent research efforts. Chapter 4 discusses an experiment that uses social media and physical urban public space to engage with members of Malmö's graffiti world. The experiment entails creating graffiti-themed scenes and arranging scavenger hunts for them in and around Malmö. And those of you who attended the conference in 2020 might remember that I did a presentation on this part of the project then. A central finding is that this experiment has further bolstered my standing as an agent with a recognized position as a chronicler within the world of graffiti writing. The book concludes with an epilogue that briefly discusses the emerging technology of artificial intelligence, as well as the possible effects of text-based image generators on the graffiti world and the use of visual methods. Now that we're able to rather effortlessly type into a computer what we want to see and then have images generated, this may have some implications for how we can use visual methods, both positive and negative. There's of course a lot more to say about this book, but I think that I'm going to leave it here, and then I would love to take any questions and comments that you may have. And also, I hope to be in Lisbon next year to show and make available the book in person. Thank you. You're muted, Pedro.
Sorry, I was saying that if someone wants to make some questions online, they can do also. I was saying also that the people are needing a break here in the auditorium. They are for since after the lunch here. And but of course, if someone wants to make some question, please raise the hand online or just step in. Or I think it's really great. Hopefully to see you next year, Peter. Of course, it would be always a good sign that the conference is still on. I'm planning to change some stuff, but I will share later on in the last day with more details. But yeah, changing is it's the way things are. Still going on since 10 editions, so it's always changing, right? So the best for your family, and we keep in touch. Hope not to see you leave all from there online. I will keep the session open. We'll make a break, like 5 to 10 minutes break, and we'll be back with an online presentation first, and then Ollie, and then Susan Anson, that they should be all outside already to make the final presentations of the day. So thank you so much, Peter, again, and talk soon. Okay, bye. See you soon.
I will try to be in time. So a little bit about myself. I am a sociologist and urban researcher from Ukraine. Oh, I'm sorry. I hear myself. Can you maybe switch off the mic? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, now it's much better. So I am sociologist and urban researcher from Ukraine. Now I am basing in Finland, in University of Turku and University of the Arts in Helsinki. But I have spent quite a lot of time before the last year, the February of the last year in St. Petersburg, where I was working as a associate professor in urban studies, and I was specializing in urban culture and placemaking public spaces, and certainly last year changed my life dramatically. But still, I would like to present you a project which I find quite particular also in this political situation which is now occurring in the world, and also in Russia, and also in the heart of the Europe. I will be speaking about the Urban Art Laboratory, which is a form of engaging with everyday life as I interpret it. So it is a form of production of urban creativity. And I actually have a number here, which is 25. And this is the number of the lines or the streets which were explored in the framework of this urban art laboratory. So to start with, why actually is the format of urban art laboratory interesting? Well, because it is a format which links together people and places in one continuum time and space continuum. It is a hotspot for emerging of new ideas and senses and sensitivities and emotions, of engaging with space, with urban space, which is quite often alienated and quite distanced from the real people who live in a routine but do not engage with the city space because of the orders. And a multidisciplinary format, which I discuss here, format combining urban studies with artistic engagement and artistic performativity, helps the participants of the laboratory to open up their visions and to be able to understand the everydayness and the richness of the life and space of the city beyond those routines. And actually the urban art laboratory as a format is quite popular because of its interdisciplinarity and of this ability to get together and to create together. And specifically what I am interested in this particular case is in the positive way of combining urban studies and urban critical theory with artistic approach. I am using the words everyday and routine, and certainly I'm referring here, and the whole laboratory was based on the French critical theory, working with conceptualization and revolution of the everyday life in the city. Certainly the basic and maybe the most pronounced philosopher here is Henri Lefebvre, who was claiming that everyday life is alienated by the ruling classes, and the orders which is installed in how we walk the streets or how we behave in public space or how we are inclined to consume the city is detaching us from the real activity and the real creativity in the city space, and that the revolution of the everyday life has to be created to emancipate people and space of the city from the order of the capitalism. And certainly Guy Debord was, as a leader of the Situationists group, was one of the actual persons who implemented this philosophy into real life and into artistic practice. And some more philosophers like Alain de Certeau or Marc Auger, they were working with the thoughts combining understanding of everyday life is something enriching, but at the same time something alienated, and proposed different kinds of concepts such as everyday life tactics or place versus non-space or non-place, to understand how everyday life can be emancipated. And in this laboratory, we were basing on this critics and on these theories to understand how we can work with the city space, which is the space of St. Petersburg. When we were working, we were not yet aware that we are working with a city which is sort of already under the authoritarian regime, but was not yet, this was not that obvious then. And actually now, from this today's perspective, when I look at this project, I see how utopian it was, because we tried to revolutionize, or at least rethink and reconceptualize the everydayness of the city, which is now completely lost in terms of the let's say, free artistic practice. But at the same time, the way we did it, so the way we tried to build the practices of, or the scripts which were opposing or were not aligning with the order can be also thought of today when we when me, myself, and for example my colleagues who used to work in St. Petersburg try to understand if there is any future at all for the city. And following the post-colonial studies, I would like to think, and I would like to hope, that artistic practices which can be as scripts of those who are colonized and who are oppressed inside of the city, they can be still developed, and they can still have some freedom thinking and search for freedom, even in these severe conditions of political repressions, which are there now. So coming back to what we were doing back then, you see in the end of 2020, we were working with one part of the city, which is an island. You see it on a map, and we were working with its particular structural items, which are the lines. You see them in red. The lines versus streets, or actually they are actual streets, but they were not intended to, because they were intended to be canals filled with water. I will tell about this in a minute. And also you see some photographs of the process which we were running. So 3 curators, including me coming from urban studies side, another curator coming from performative arts side, and also cultural manager and producer. We compiled a sort of interdisciplinary framework when we worked together with 33 people, participants, or but students, but better say participants, with various backgrounds, ranging from sociology up to real street art and performance art. And we worked for 2.5 months to understand the urban space continuum, to explore the lines, and also to develop some new or alternative vision for those lines in an artistic format. So this is the context which we have been working with. This is a real island, but actually the original plan, urban plan for it, was quite utopian. It was a plan resembling the planning system of Venice or Amsterdam, favored with Peter I, when the streets are the canals filled with water, and they were doing like that. But the real situation, the real condition was that the waters of the Neva River surrounding the islands, they were coming into the canals and were just flooding this island. So the canals were then covered with ground, and they have sort of kept their name as the lines, but they never came up to be what they were meant to be. So this island is sort of an utopian in itself. And it really combines many different lifestyles. So it is a city center which has quite big prices for house rent and for the housing itself. But at the same time, there are quite many traces of, let's say, Soviet and even post-Soviet approach to urban culture, like, for example, very different and disordered cultural codes on the streets, variety of signs, variety of ads, and no single cultural approach to the continuum of this island and to its integrity. So it's quite, I would say, diverse, and at the same time quite maybe interesting to explore because of this diversity. The agenda or the time frame, the structure of our urban art lab is like this. So there was a phase when we were really working hard with the theory and with the readings of French critical theory, which actually gave our participants and ourselves as curators some shared conceptual field to understand the everydayness, the routines, the notions of optics, the notions of inequality, and the notions of order and resistance and others. We then proposed our participants to do research basing on this different pieces of theory and at the same time conceptual works. And this research was certainly guided by this critical stance. Then the participants, they were progressing this different sort of data or their experiences they got from the city space into artifacts, which were very different in formats, and I will show it to you in a minute. And afterwards, we had an exhibition of these 25 artifacts produced by people in micro teams. And this exhibition was also mediated by the participants. So they were exploring, they were discussing what they explored with those who came. By combining these different approaches from urban studies and from the arts, we actually could, I hope that we could create a very interesting optics, which was interdisciplinary really by its background. For example, these are different kinds of formats of approaches to understand, to research, to engage with, to collect some data and understandings about the city. So, for example, there are quite sort of traditional for qualitative urban studies, like for urban ethnography and for urban anthropology, approaches such as emotional mapping, mental mapping, visual ethnography, or rhythm analysis, which we explored based on Henri Lefebvre's works. At the same time, there were some approaches used, such as performative walking or dealing with found objects and found art that were more flexible, intuitive, more aesthetically led than research formats of approaching and engagement with the space. Together, they created different mixtures. So actually, participants, they could select different kinds of these research approaches, and in the end, they received different kinds of experiences and could recreate them into different kinds of artifacts. Well, certainly, it is interesting that actually we did succeed with creating a critical approach and critical prism, because all of the works, all of the artifacts and all of those experiences of the participants they were describing in the end in the exhibition, they really were containing critical ideas. So all of the works were somehow dealing with specific urban issues or issues of everyday life. For example, exclusion of certain social groups, such as adolescents or people in service, dullness, emptiness, and alienation of this space from real life practices of people, disintegrity of the material space by fencing or gatedness, absence or hidden character of culture or cultures when they are invisible, some social estrangement in between the people, even in between the neighbors of one and the same yard. So they were there, and participants tried to work with them. For example, here on the photograph, you see installation, or the photograph of an installation which was called Glamorous Urbanism, and it actually contains a photograph on the background of a typical courtyard of St. Petersburg and Vasilevsky Island, which is quite dull, I would say quite empty, which is reworked, you see, with this red and azul colors, and also some glamorous benches are there, and also the fountain inside, and some plants. And the photograph itself is the background for this installation with a disco ball and some other plants and a carpet, which is very particular for Soviet type of flats. In a way, this is a tactic to show the glamorous urbanism, which is kind of a cheap glamour or cheap chic, but it resembles the real wish of people who live in the courtyards to change their courtyards. But when you ask them about what they would like to change, they say that they would like to see a fountain there. So this is a sort of an ironic concept, trying to tackle the issue of the emptiness and the absence of identity in a courtyard, which is the primary public space for people, but at the same time to tackle the irony and maybe the absurdity of how people sort of lack imagination, and how they would like to see the fountain in each courtyard. The fountain is maybe not the best solution. Or this photograph. Yeah.
Just to say that 5 minutes
Yes.
for concluding.
Yes. Okay. Or this photograph, for example, is appealing to the disturbances and the troubles of the people with disabled, who are disabled and who have certain limitations in the physical mobility because they have to use the wheelchairs, for example. And this is the installation resembling the barriers of the material, of the materiality and the material landscape of the street, when artists or participants of this group, they show some barriers which are all around the street, and actually they hint at the absence of this particular social group in the streets, because there are actually none people who are disabled moving through the streets in St. Petersburg. When summing up, in the end, we as curators and me as a researcher, myself also, we saw that participants actually tried to use different kinds of material forms which also have a symbolic meaning and which resemble this everydayness for them. So they try to use different kinds of materials or sounds or traces, found objects, or even rituals they saw, for example, rituals of interacting in between the neighbors or in between the people who are selling something in the shops, in the streets. And the artifacts which were created were quite different, certainly in manner, and we did not restrict them because we really wanted to open up this box of creativity. And you see here the different kinds of forms which were used for the eventual artifacts, representing those different kinds of everydayness and different visions into this everydayness. And when creating the conceptual texts describing those artifacts, participants, well, artists, they were using quite a lot of interesting concepts, which per se are quite interesting to understand and to see, like the concept of alienation or the concept of emotion, the concept of utopia. And these artifacts, there really are all of them little stories in themselves, yes, and they create new kind of roots, new narratives based on the narratives which were explored, new visions, new symbolic landscapes based on those points of interest which were somehow deciphered, and even the stories based on the narratives of those who participants met in the streets. So all of this is combining into an exhibition, which in itself, I assume, is a reenactment of Vasilevsky Island and its 25 lines or streets, which is giving an insight into the hidden everydayness. So beyond the routine, or under the routines, which are quite restricted and ordered, there is some vibrancy of life, which is quite hidden or unequal or silent, sometimes invisible. But thanks to this kind of artistic engagement and also to the eventual exhibition, there is a possibility to reenact the whole of the island, not even one street, but 25 of them, into an interesting new image, which would be presenting those hidden visual images, sounds, narratives, and social groups, and give way to the silent stories. And here I stop, and I would be glad to hear your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can see a bit the audience. It's dispersed, but it's a big auditorium, but there are some people here. I don't know if someone have questions for Alexandra for this faraway reality, but at the same time in the everyday news. No one online. If someone has some question, please raise the hand. This one, yeah. I think it's better otherwise. So
so you mentioned, maybe I just missed it, but I don't know.
I'm sorry, but I don't hear you. It's very bad sound. Sorry.
Isabel is asking about who were the participants. I don't know if you talked about that, but who were the participants?
Yeah, I mentioned that they were various backgrounds. Most of them were young professionals, as we used to say, like emerging artists or junior specialists. They could be MA students, but also graduates who have started their career in performative arts, but also in sociology and anthropology and architecture. So it was quite a mixture, and it was done on purpose because we wanted to achieve this interdisciplinarity of visions and of previous backgrounds, and to merge the approaches coming from architecture, for example, towards the city space, but also from the performative arts towards the city space, because this would be quite a creative sort of mixture, maybe a little bomb of this different views on the city space. Worked out quite well. People were working in small teams. Each of the team was dealing with one of the lines or one of the streets.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if not, there's Susan here. There's nobody else asking, so.
Yes. Let's say, about you, I don't know if you hear me, but I was noticing how she was being a little bit nostalgic about it and saying it was some utopia, looking back on it, and they didn't really realize how much authoritarianism was around them, and I just wanted to hear her talk a little bit.
Did you hear the question?
Unfortunately, only the word nostalgic. That's all. I'm sorry if you could
Okay.
repeat it.
So it's for you to talk a bit about this the change that occurred somehow, and this turn to the authoritarian, more authoritarian state, let's say, that was already present, but then you, looking back, nostalgically, you can see that it's not possible to be thinking like you were thinking. So Susan Phillips, she was like asking a bit for you to talk a bit more about that. How do you feel like that?
Yes, I think that, well, at least I got the idea of the question. I hope I can answer. Yes, I think that it is extremely important actually to be self-reflective of the practices one was doing before the dramatic change, because all of us are living in quite complex urban situations, and none of us are sure that next time something traumatic can happen and next day you will be living you can't be sure that next day you will be living in the same conditions. So it is very important to be very reflective and very critical towards the things you are doing today in the context you are doing today, and also be very sure about the political dimension of the context in the city. And I think that it is important still, I'm Ukrainian, and you see that for me, it's sort of a very, very dramatic mixture that I'm today talking about St. Petersburg, but it is important to understand what kind of, let's say, resistance, what practices of resistance were there and could be there even now, because we can't just go on with thinking that authoritarian regime has won over, because, I mean, the authoritarian regimes are not something that we are safe to be with in Europe. So this little hints of resistance and those forms, pedagogical forms of how to create this resistance, have to be explored in different phases, pre-war and after war, for Russia, certainly. So I think that it is extremely important, and not just nostalgic, but it really practices or makes your critical mind better. And I really call for this critical and reflective approach in all other countries, because you never know.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question and for the answer.
Thank you.
I think we are okay. Thank you for your presentation,
Yes.
Alexander.
Yes, thank you, Pedro, for inviting. It's really just a wonderful conference, and I will be always following it now, since now. Okay.
Please
Thank
keep around. I will
sure.
call to come. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think we are going to share the canvas from here, and it will be a movie, right? Presentation first?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I will share the canvas with the presentation. That's this one.
Yeah, and if we can.
And you are on the presentation. So back. Let's take this chunk of information from here. And this I will minimize.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Pedro, for inviting us to show the film and your team. I am presenting a short film with a little introduction to the artist, Dr. D, and hopefully a Q&A with Dr. D live afterwards. So firstly, where's the...
You can use it now.
Right, so basically on the first slide, we can just see there's an intro there to the film. I think what is, I don't know how to use this. There we go. If we get into this, I've got a bit of text up there by one of the team who we worked with, which is Adrian Burnham, who is probably one of the most informed people on Dr. D. So I asked him to write some text for this project. It was so good, I don't want to put it up there actually, because it sort of just it makes mine look slightly different. But what I do have afterwards is some flyers with the full text version that Adrian wrote about this. So, wrong way.
Yeah, sorry, I will pass you by.
Yeah, okay. As Aid explained in the earlier slide, Damon's work is social commentary, and he delivers it in many physical forms. So here we can see we've got paste up, we've got some physical work that he made out of plywood, hardwood. He also does, as in the first slide, three-dimensional objects that he pre-prepares and puts on site. And as well, there is stencil work in some of his work from previous times, I think. So
If you want to shift with me.
yeah, okay, let's do that. It's better. Thank you. But his work never really veers from his core driving force, which is how we are controlled and who is doing the controlling. His works are sometimes deliberate takes on news headlines, or they could be mistakes made by predictive text, or even misheard conversations.
Can I distribute this?
Yeah, sure, yeah. But they are always done with perfect timing in response to socio-political situations. Let's see if I can do this here.
Just the arrows, use the arrows.
Okay. Where are the arrows on here? Right, okay, sorry, a bit slow on that. So here we can see that his HM Prison London work is something that he developed over a period of time, and HMP was Her Majesty's Prison, but now we have His Majesty's Prison. But the beauty of the HM Prison title allows it to be used anywhere, in any city, any town in the whole country. So it's genius really is in its adaptability. So as we can see here, during lockdown and while we were doing this project, Manchester students got locked up in a dormitory. So we went up to Manchester and actually continued our project up there. So, you know, this was actually not just a project to make a film about, it was a major piece of work for Damon in his own right. As you can see here, some of his work is adaptable by public, which is what it's meant to be, really. You know, it's not exclusive to him, he's making it inclusive for everybody. So there's a few pieces from here from the students in Manchester at that particular time. But I guess his main sort of area is billboards and subvertising. So here we've got two pieces that he's made himself. So the first one on the right, the crap hard, on the left is that, is basically a take on Tesco's Club Card 2, which basically replaced Tesco's Club Card 1, but gave you half of what you had before they did it. And then on the right, this is basically him getting back to his humour and having a dig at the public's gullibility in nature when given instructions from authority. And then in this one, this is kind of where you see his subvertising in its full force in a way. This was originally an advert for the TV series Prison Break, which is basically having a go at the CIA and their kind of acceptable interrogation techniques, which I guess was waterboarding. So this is where he would just take little additives to an original piece rather than generating the whole thing himself. And then here we go. This is Damon at work. Basically the invisible man. It's strange how Damon does all of this in broad daylight, in full view, in plain sight, and nobody really takes any notice whatsoever. You know, it just doesn't register with them that what's there before and what came afterwards are two completely different things. And the second one is, you know, some political statement. You know, so the public don't notice, but the authorities do. I think the authorities have a very slightly different opinion of this, and I think so do the media companies whose spaces he borrows. So this is just a little insight into some of the detail that goes into his work. So as you can see here, that normally under each billboard there will be a sign for which media company owns that space, and here is a couple of bits where he subverted those. So I think you can see underneath what they were originally and what he turned them into. So once we got through that little bit, part of the film, and this is borrowing a bit from Damon again, is where we look at what are the symbols of capitalism, wealth, power, and success. You know, the City of London represents that, and it kind of features in the film. But you know, it's those images of what people see as the city are obviously not very accurate, really. You know, because for one instance, it's the biggest money laundering centre in the whole world. And it sort of fed into this system of what Boris Johnson kind of gave us as his political theory for how the country was going to get back on its feet, which was the trickle-down effect. So basically, all the money is earned in the city, they spend all their money, and it trickles down to us mere mortals through one way or another. Unfortunately, what he didn't recognise or encounter or make space for was when things are tight or don't go very well, even for the people in the city, they just don't spend their money, so we don't get anything. So the whole thing just collapsed. But as we go on with the project, which is basically what this turned into, we started on a plan of action, which I put up there, which hopefully you can see in some sort of detail. We looked at like 20 different billboard sites. We assessed, you know, we took cameras there. We looked at every angle, whether they were photographic enough, whether we could be hidden. You know, what was the success rate of working on that billboard. So every shot was planned and put into a time frame. That meant we could hopefully avoid detection. Now, the billboards were especially difficult to sort out. So as you can see here, with the red dots, we actually moved around quite a lot. Some of them were site specific, especially one of them, which is for something we did for Grenfell Tower. But as you can see, it was going to be difficult for anybody to work out how we could be doing all of those in one day, which obviously helped us with not being detected. So day one, we basically went out and captured a load of symbols and systems of capitalism, which was going around the city and sort of filming that particular part. Day two was capturing historical pieces that we knew that had survived over time, which some of Damon's work, you know, they're still around. You know, some are slightly hidden, some have been covered up, but then revealed again. And then there was a few new pieces as well. So I think what I'd like to do now, oh yeah, actually, this is just a bit, just basically saying nothing lasts forever. So the Test of the Shame one, which was basically Prince Andrew, we shot that opposite a estate agents who came out while we're filming it and kind of asked us what we're doing and why we'd chosen to do it opposite their shop. So I guess after we'd gone, either they or somebody who was a Prince Andrew supporter got the hump. So, you know, I mean, there were people on social media supporting Prince Andrew because of this piece. So, you know, just goes to show how crazy that is. The joy diversion piece, that became an ongoing battle with these taggers between Damon and the taggers, and he would go back and paint back in the lettering, and then they'd come back and do it again. So he kept that little game up for a while. That's my brief intro. What I'd like to do now is show the film. Can we? Oh, yes, please. That'd be well helpful.
Okay, thank you. I've seen the film already. It's a really interesting piece of work. So
It's 11 minutes long. It's slightly different take on what some films have done before.
let me just start from the beginning and
Suddenly I'm falling. I'm falling upright.
England is so powerful.
Suddenly I'm falling. I'm falling upright.
England is so powerful. But when a great power like that strikes defenseless people, it shows its brutality, its own weakness, especially when those people do not strike back. But if we riot, if we fight back, we become the vandals and they become the law.
I think there are two ways in which people are controlled. First of all, frighten people, and secondly, demoralize them. The top 1% of the world's population own 80% of the world's wealth. It's incredible that people put up with it, but they're poor, they're demoralized, they're frightened, and therefore they think perhaps the safest thing to do is take orders and hope for the best.
What I'm doing is putting the unreal amongst the real and challenging people to notice.
Suddenly I'm falling. I'm falling upright.
England is so powerful. But when a great power like that strikes defenseless people, it shows its brutality, its own weakness, especially when those people do not strike back. But if we riot, if we fight back, we become the vandals and they become the law.
See, I think there are two ways in which people are controlled. First of all, frighten people, and secondly, demoralize them. The top 1% of the world's population own 80% of the world's wealth. It's incredible that people put up with it, but they're poor, they're demoralized, they're frightened, and therefore they think perhaps the safest thing to do is take orders and hope for the best.
What I'm doing is putting the unreal amongst the real and challenging people to notice. Subvertising is what I do. Subvertising is the opposite of advertising. It's flipping it on its head, sticking it back to the man.